Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series. We take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. In this video, I'll be reviewing the player supplement Might vs. Magic, designed by Dave Panfilo for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping, supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Might vs. Magic is an adaptation of the awesome series of Might and Magic computer role-playing games. I wish. No, Might vs. Magic is actually a player-focused supplement that adds new subclasses, specifically one for each class, including Artificer and Blood Hunter, with the theme of a high magic fantasy world. So think more Eberron and less, I guess, Game of Thrones example of a low magic fantasy world, because Forgotten Realms is still pretty high magic. But a lot of the abilities and themes are centered around like countering magic or shutting down spellcasters, or just, you know, spellcasters just having what other abilities they can have. But mainly it's for martial classes to be able to have different kinds of counterspell type abilities. That's not a bad idea. And for the most part, these classes are so they're functional, right? They work, they feel balanced. My main problem is that very few of them are interesting, which sounds bad. I get that the champion fighter exists for a reason, right? It's extremely easy to run. It just gives you a bunch of like passive bonuses, like increasing your critical threat range. And it's, you know, fighter's already kind of an easy class. You know, you're not having to worry about spells and sneak attack bonuses and all that. So it makes sense that they would have like, look, let's just give somebody just the baseline. Like, I don't have to worry about things. I just want to swing my weapon every turn. That's fine. And it's admirable to even include subclasses that are simpler like that just kind of add you basic bonuses and features that you don't really have to worry about. Unfortunately, when you get most of those in a new supplement, it's just kind of boring to look at and read. And the designer even mentions themselves that, this is on the DM's Guild, you're looking for extra content. So more than likely, you're going to want things that are a little bit more interesting, a little more tactically rewarding. But in this case, honestly, only like 2 or 3 of the subclasses of the bunch did I think fit that bill. Most of them are, again, they're functional, they've got useful abilities, but a lot of the usefulness is just through like passives, like giving you extra resistances and things that aren't just very exciting and don't generate those cool like player marquee moments like, I'm going to do my cool class ability now. And that's not necessarily on the subclass, but it is increasingly becoming on the subclass, especially in a post-Tasha's world, which, to be fair, this supplement was designed before Tasha's. But still, we had some neat classes before then. But especially looking at through the lens of what Tasha's gave us, which is a lot of really cool class ideas. By the way, I do really love this cover art. We've been looking at this for a while now. Very comic book inspired, which you usually don't see in fantasy D&D art, but I would like to see more of it because I think that's really cool looking. The actual formatting works well. The font is a little on the small end, but I didn't have any problem reading it. I don't know if it's just because of the font style that was used. I didn't have any problem with the layout or the production. The writing and editing is actually quite good. In fact, the designer uses a cool second-person writing style to describe that little paragraph at the beginning of each subclass. So instead of using a third person, which is they do this, they do that, and kind of give examples of different types of those characters, it's you are this, you feel this power, and it is a much more intimate, cool like way of reading that class ability, and they're all very well written, so that part's a huge thumbs up. My main thumbs down is that I just wasn't really excited by any of these classes, and unfortunately that's, well, the good news is that's not this whole book. It's only half the book. The bad news is it's half the book. So I'm not a huge fan of a lot of these subclasses. We'll kind of go over some of them. But, well, for example, the Artificer, the Dismantler. As part of an attack, as a melee action, you can use your reaction to basically lower the enemy immunity or resistance to either go from immunity to just resistance, or go from resistance to nothing, or go from nothing to vulnerability, essentially giving them a specific debuff of a certain kind of damage type, which is interesting because I don't know of any other classes that can do that, and D&D is usually not a big debuffing. I mean, there's crowd control for sure, but specifically like debuffs, there's usually not a whole lot of that in there. So that's a very useful ability, but how engaging is it to do that? Like, oh, I hit you, and now you've got, you lost your fire resistance. That's very useful to have, like, in the party, but in terms of, it just doesn't feel very exciting or interesting. And, like, you also gain, like, extra attack, you gain heavy weapons. You're supposed to be more of, like, this kind of tanky anti-magic artificer, I guess. And then later on, you gain the ability to absorb, like, those resistances and defensive abilities. So it's useful. It feels balanced. Like, I don't have any problems with that. It just doesn't have that extra spice of life that makes a lot of the subclasses interesting. I mean, all right, so Barbarian, when you rage, you gain extra resistances to certain spell schools. Whenever somebody casts a spell, you could, like, move up there and make an attack. Later on, maybe your attacks can ignore, like, mage armor or shield. Again, it fits that theme of being anti-spellcaster, but none of it, I mean, and you can see here where the entire subclasses for a lot of these take up half a page. There's not a lot of, mechanics there. And again, I get that the champion fighter is a thing. You can have more easier, straightforward classes, but when you have like 10 of those in one supplement, it just reads too boring. It's just, there's not enough there. Especially for martial classes, when you have opportunities where your class is already fairly, easy to run compared to, wizards and sorcerers who have lots of spells and things that they're dealing with. You can allow the players to give them some more wiggle room and let them have some other things to use. And still very useful abilities, like the College of Propaganda for the Bard. At 6th level, you can use your Bardic Inspiration as a bonus to initiative rolls to the entire party. Again, incredibly useful. Maybe not the most exciting thing, especially because the 3rd level ability is that when you spend when a creature uses your Bardic Inspiration, they just can't have disadvantage on whatever they're trying to do. Yes, that's useful, but is it really that exciting or interesting? And that's kind of the problem for a lot of these different things. The Druid Circle of Fathoms is all about water. You basically specialize in creatures that can turning into creatures with a swim speed, but you could just be the circle of moon, where you could just transform into better creatures anyway. You also gain like water breathing and swim speed, although again you could just be a Triton to get those abilities. It's just not enough really exciting things happening compared to like summoning a tentacle or like the rogue manifesting a Psyblade, the warlock having like a genie bottle they can disappear into. I mean, artificers they can build turrets and have robot dogs and basically become Iron Man with your own suit of armor. Like, just really crazy stuff in Tasha's has really raised the bar in terms of what am I looking for when I'm looking for extra subclasses for players to be, and there would be other, some interesting ideas. I don't mind the theme of being anti-magic or being this weird might versus magic thing. There's some potential there, and an example of that, the fighter and the rogue have two interesting potentials that are not fully realized. In the fighter's case, you gain these anchors, which you can call out a spell school, and they're recharged whenever a spell of that school is cast, I believe by either enemies or allies. And then those anchors do certain things. This one would have benefited from being able to like pick and choose your anchor, I think. But instead, you just gain one anchor at 3rd level, one at 7th, one at 10th. It's like the same progression for everybody. And the only one that's kind of interesting is the 10th level one that gives you a temporary flight that you have to use as a bonus action, but basically a super jump kind of thing, which that is cool. But the rest of them are just like you impose disadvantage on a save, or you can deal a little bit of extra damage because of the spell that you stored. So I like the system of you having these anchors and you having to call out the spell schools when you're making them and all of that. But the result isn't that exciting. I think it could have been fixed easily by letting you choose these different anchors to be able to use. And then for the rogue is just crap until 13th level, which unfortunately the rogue subclasses are hard to do because you get your 3rd level ability and then not again until 9th level. So it's a long time before your rogue subclass really comes into its own, unless you really front load that ability in 3rd level. In this case, it does not. Whenever you're falling, you'll deal extra damage, which how niche is that? Or whenever you do a readied action weapon attack with an enemy casting a spell, you can counter it. Again, I think the ranger has a counter ability on one of their spells. They don't have to do all that to do it either. It's like a once per day thing. So it's a really kind of crappy rogue. But then the 13th level, you get a really amazing cool ability, which should have been the front-loaded thing, which is whenever you interrupt a spell or you cause someone to lose concentration, you gain a buff or feature based on the spell school that was used. For example, if it was Abjuration, you gain temporary hit points. If it's Conjuration, you can teleport. If it was Illusion, you can turn invisible for a minute, which is huge for a rogue. That's a really neat ability, and the fact that you might not even know what kind of spell that you're, breaking their concentration of, and then all of a sudden you get this extra trait. That's fantastic, but you don't get it till 13th level, and let's face it, a lot of D&D games don't even make it that high. So again, both the fighter and the rogue had neat ideas in there, but they needed to be kind of rejiggered to be able to use those features and make them more interesting. Now, the few exceptions in here, the ones that I actually did enjoy and thought were interesting, they're all well-designed classes, but that actually were of interest to me in terms of, oh, this is a cool feature. The Ranger Reclaimer has Primal Traps, which is neat and frankly should be a thing that Rangers can do, which is you can arm these special traps, and this is the case of the maneuvers where you gain... you gain, I think, 2 traps at 3rd level and then additional traps as you level up. And these traps can be, restraining webs or a swinging log that knocks people back, or the giant bear claw trap that can trap people and do damage. You got poison darts. And then when you make it to 11th level, you can gain extra, kind of magical infused traps, like anti-magic traps and kind of fairy fire things. It's a really neat system, and at some point you can even deploy a trap and then also be able to attack on the same turn. So you have to even sacrifice action economy. Really, really neat idea that I was like, that's a cool Ranger thing, and I like it. And then the Wizard, I had to look this up because I'm not that familiar with 9th level spells, and I imagine a lot of folks aren't. The Wizard, Sage of the Sevenfold Veil, takes a 9th level spell that is Prismatic Wall and breaks it up into this progression system that you gain additional wards of the wall. So the spell as written is you gain all these different layers to this special spectral light wall, and all these layers do different things as players pass, as enemies in theory pass through them. In this case, you gain Prismatic Wall as a certain amount of casts per long rest, depending on your level, and then you gain additional color barriers, and all the barriers, they do different things if people walk through them. They can block different kinds of spells. They have all these different features. They're also weak against certain effects. It's a whole extra system the players to keep track of. And then you gain them as you level up. I believe it's every 2 levels you gain another color ward. So there's a whole cool progression system built into the whole class. And then the big negative trait you have to accept to be able to do this is you have to completely forsake 1 or 2 spell schools. It's 1 if it's any of them except Divination, Illusion, and then it ties both of those together. I guess the designer decided those are 2 that are easy to wash away, so you have to get rid of both of them, which is kind of old school D&D, because I think that was how the old school worked, whereas if you chose a spell school you couldn't choose to specialize in, you couldn't choose the opposite one. Somebody in the comments, I'm sure, will be able to inform me better on that on older D&D editions. But I thought that was a cool idea. You take a 9th level spell and you build it into an entire subclass's progression system where they can kind of do these different wards and then level up as they get them. I thought that was pretty neat. But those are basically 2 of the 14 classes that I looked at and thought, okay, that's neat. A lot of the classes might have a cool ability here or there, but overall it just didn't seem... none of them felt like they were poorly designed or imbalanced necessarily. It just didn't seem very exciting. It felt like they were more along the veins of that champion fighter. And I keep mentioning champion fighter because I can't think of another class that's that kind of, I don't want to say dumbed down, that's disparaging, but that overly straightforward and simplistic, basically. A lot of them felt like that. It just takes systems you already had, like Rage or Bardic Inspiration, and just kind of makes it so you do a little bit of extra things whenever you do that, and doesn't really make it any more interesting or interactive for the player. So, but as I mentioned, the good news is that is only half the book, and the second half is actually adding new spells and magic items. Now, this is where things get interesting, because the designer, which I'm very thankful that they wrote it's at the very end, I think, this design guidelines thing, which I would love to see this in every supplement, actually. But the designer actually just wrote a page of information and said, here's my thought process for writing this entire guidebook and where I came from. And the whole time I'm looking at this, the designer, all these abilities and things, and there's variant rules for expanding counterspell specifically, in terms of worrying about spell schools and being able to having different, like there's a counterspell version at 2nd level, at 3rd level, at 4th level, at 5th level, and they all do different, reflecting spells and absorbing spells. And I thought, this is some Magic the Gathering bullshit that would drive me crazy at the table of D&D. And sure enough, I read the designer's guidelines, and they said in the design guidelines, the number one influence for the new spells in the product was actually another Wizards of the Coast property, Magic the Gathering. The breadth of counterspells, copied spells, and rules designed to be broken in MTG inspired me to expand rather than merely replace the awkward and imbalanced counterspell in core 5th edition. So you have to accept that the designer's thought process on counterspell being innately imbalanced. The fact that it's a catch-all, one-use spell that can counter any spell. However, it requires a skill check at a certain level, right? And I believe Dispel Magic, I think, is the same way. Or maybe Dispel Magic, you have to use a spell slot, I think. And in this case, the designer says, all right, well, let's get rid of Counterspell and Dispel Magic as written, and instead we're going to create our own versions of those spells. And essentially, first of all, it breaks up Dispel Magic into a 1st level spell, and then just says, hey, at 1st level, it dispels 1st level spells. If you want to cast it at 2nd level, it dispels 2nd level spells. So it's kind of similar to the way it's written, but in this case, it's just if you use a spell slot, it will dispel the magic. For a counterspell, if you want to, obviously counterspell, it's being cast right then. Now you've got Break Spell, Mimic Spell, Absorb Spell. What are the other ones I wrote down? Quell Spell, that's a mouthful. Capture Spell, Spell Disjunction, and all of these things are essentially different versions of Counterspell, but tied to different levels. So for Break Spell, you have to, and there's a new system, by the way, called Charge, where you cast a spell and then you kind of hold it. And this is weird because there is no system for this in D&D 5e, and the designer says, I've introduced a new system, which is you can hold a charge of a spell. You can only hold one charge, but it doesn't require concentration. So you're not using your reaction, importantly, to cast Counterspell anymore, basically, unless it says in the thing that you have to use your reaction to do something else. Instead, you have to just cast this beforehand, and they all last an hour, and then it goes off. It's basically like readying a Counterspell like before combat occurs. So it's an interesting, I'm not sure what the reasoning of that was, maybe to free up the spellcaster's action economy a little bit more. And all of these spells add additional ways of basically counterspelling. So Break Spell, works the same as Counterspell, but you have to name a spell school of magic. It's a 1st level spell, so you could counter spells at 1st level, but only if you cast this spell ahead of time and you name that certain school of magic and they happen to cast that school of magic. For Absorb Spell, it's the same idea. You have to name the school of magic, and then you counter it, and then you can expend, or you regain an expanded spell slot. And then other ones, you Reflect Spell, that you cast that spell instantly, and then Capture Spell, you cast that spell instantly, but can then redirect any of the choices that were made in terms of how it was cast. So they really expand on what you can do with Counterspell, and I feel like maybe this all should have been one subclass. Maybe there should have been like a sorcerer who was specifically all about, like, their magic was based on manipulating the magic of others or something. Because it seems like such a advanced, complex system. And I would very much not introduce this in my games. As I mentioned, I said this was, and folks do like Magic the Gathering. I'm not trying to say you're wrong for liking that. And if you want to make your spellcasting games in D&D more like Magic the Gathering, then by all means, this will be be very rewarding for you. For me, that's something I hated about Magic, which was like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing, the back and forth just craziness that resulted in just turns lasting forever and just a whole bunch of gotchas and take that's, and one of the reasons I've bounced off of that game since. But this introduces that to D&D, which I would be extremely not wanting to do at all, because it would just make it creates more time on the spellcasters, which they already have a lot of time as it is. I think it focuses on the wrong elements. Now, granted, the martial classes might have a lot of extra things they can do now with this supplement in terms of being able to also counter those spells. The monk gains the ability, for example, to deflect magic, just like deflect arrows. But still, this adds a lot of new complexities to the entire countering system that for me, was not at all warranted or desired. So that's a big part of what these spells are. There are some other extra just cool, interesting spells in general, and that's fine. But like probably a good chunk of these spells, there's over 20 of them, probably at least half of them have to do with expanding on those counterspelling rules and being able to essentially give you a version of counterspell at every single level. So, and they all do, obviously better things as you level up, but a lot of them require you to have that spell school also. So it makes it more, it expands it, but also makes it more oddly restrictive. And then finally, we have new magic items. And here, it's nothing but thumbs up for me. I actually am a big fan of these magic items. They're really inventive, they're creative, they're interesting. Just for some examples, the Armor of Echoes triggers reaction effects depending on what school. Kind of similar to where the Rogue ability did, where you broke their concentration, you got some kind of buff. In this case, if somebody casts a spell of a certain school, you can use your reaction to then use a certain kind of buff depending on that school. That's a really interesting thing. Some of these items are kind of funny, which there's one of the classes, was it the Sorcerer or the Warlock, where it was like you were a magnate, just kind of a rich person. Yeah, the Warlock. You just kind of worked for like a noble or something, and all your powers had to deal with that, and it was all kind of tongue-in-cheek. And there's things in here like, the Landlord's Cummerbund, Eggshell Walkers. I just want to read you the description. When you make an accidental faux pas due to personal insensitivity or cultural ignorance while wearing these over-padded boots, they stun you for 1 round before you can err. Like, I guess it's a cursed item. It's just goofy, but I don't know. I appreciate that. There's a high priority, which is a legendary staff that allows you to cast Time Stop, as well as giving you and your allies cannot be surprised, and I believe you always surprise enemies. The Glaive of Decline starts at a +10 bonus, but goes down by 1 every time you attack. That's an interesting concept that I would immediately rebalance to make it, okay, this is a +4 that goes down all the way until it's like, I don't know, maybe like a +0, and then it could even go negative. Like, you could balance that. That's a cool idea. I wouldn't do it at +10. That's ridiculous. But I would, balance that to where you could introduce that a little bit earlier and have it be like, every attack, it's going to be really good for a couple attacks and then kind of become worse and worse as you go. There's a shield that projects a lightly obscuring mist. There's a Talent Scouter monocle where you can gain insight into other class levels' abilities. I just like a lot of these magic items. They're just very clever and fun, and it's a relief after these somewhat boring subclasses. They're like, oh no, these are actually really cool magic items and fun ideas. And the designer sure enough said, well, I made sure to, I wanted to keep the subclasses kind of, balanced and reined in, but the magic items I kind of went nuts with. Like, go nuts with the subclasses. That's fine. And I think, and again, this is unfortunately released before Tasha's, but Tasha's proved that you can have balanced classes that still have really crazy cool things that they can do to where the player feels like they're doing some really unique special stuff. They're turning on something, or they're summoning some, tentacle from the deep, or popping in their, genie lamp or something. There's so many neat ideas, and this one, just the supplement in general, just does not add hardly any of those neat ideas, which is certainly disappointing. But the magic items are quite good, and the spells, if you like the counterspell thing being expanded and having kind of new rules and more complexities for that, then you'll get a lot out of it. For me personally, I'm still going to put it as a pro because there's a lot of work to it, and I think it's generally well done, but with the caveat that, like, no, I would absolutely not include this in my particular games. I don't want Magic the Gathering in my D&D table. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Might versus Magic. Somebody please make a Might and Magic adventure, by the way. There's so much good content in those old games. I love them. All right, pros. Over 20 new spells, including expanding the original catch-all counterspell into multiple spells and functionalities. Just mentioned that's going to make it on the pro, even though I personally would not want to take advantage of that. If you're into having counterspell be more complex and have some more flexibility and restrictions there, I think you'll get a lot out of it. Pro, over 30 new magic weapons, armor, and items. I was a big fan of all the magic gear that's included here, and 30 is a lot for the supplement. And pro, the design guidelines that offer helpful insight into the designer's process. That's a really cool thing that I found. It's kind of hidden here right at the end, but it's just a page of insight into how the designer went about creating a lot of these designs and what their inspirations were and what the ideas were. It's just like its own post-mortem kind of baked into the book itself, which I found, especially as the reviewer and the critic, very, very helpful to get that insight. Cons, just the one, which is unfortunately half of the supplement, which are the subclasses. As much as I feel like they're decently balanced and they have functional abilities, they're just not very exciting. They don't offer a lot of new, interesting, fun, marquee things for those player characters to do, with very few exceptions. Final verdict, the new subclasses in Might vs. Magic are functional but boring, with the real treasure being the expanded counterspell rules and spells that should delight fans of Magic the Gathering. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. You can support my work on patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Wizard, Princess, Christopher, Star, Loverly, Thomas, Ian, Captain Mike, Adam, Goblin Works, Aiden, Instant Lose, and gold patrons: RPG Paper Crafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos Did, Vicente, Gilberto, Dead Lizard Lion, Sam Ross, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy 619, Sclinia, Nick, Party McButterpants, Blood Angel, Veronis, The Fireworks Factory, Baboon, Sean, AK, Cert2B, Nathan, and Fast Like a Tortoise. Thank you all very much for your support.